Okay, Kevin, I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
So where do you live?
I live in Edmonton.
What was the name of the street that you grew up on?
Yeah, we're not doing this. Yeah, we're not doing this.
This guy refusing to fall for Spark producer Michelle Parisi's password reset scam? That's Kevin Haggerty. Kevin is a professor of sociology and criminology at the University of Alberta, and his specialty is surveillance.
I think actually one of the interesting things about surveillance is people actually don't feel it. One of the things that's sort of paradoxical about surveillance is that you don't see it. And this is what makes it hard to get people concerned about it, is that, well, take an example of surveillance cameras. We all kind of know that they're out there and that they're watched, but they have a very different feel if you actually hang out in a control room and you watch what is being watched and you watch how much detail, and it's not always watching for bad people. A lot of the time people are watching women and they're watching cleavage and they're watching those types of things. And the level of scrutiny at some of the higher end places, like from 200 meters away, you can look over someone's shoulder and read their text messages on their smartphone. That is not seen. And cameras have become interesting because they started out as cameras, where what we're seeing now is that sort of the camera infrastructure is just becoming a space for never-ending upgrades to surveillance capacity. So you start with cameras, and then now we're talking about facial recognition cameras. And now in, I think, Toronto Airport, they're taking those cameras and they're augmenting them with audio. So you'll be able to hear, or the authorities will be able to hear what people are talking about as they sit around. So you just see this continual escalation in terms of the capacity. Will we have, infrared? You can't anticipate what's next coming down the pipe, but once those cameras were in place, it just becomes an opportunity to continually upgrade the capacity.
One question that's on people's minds a lot at this conference is the revelations about the NSA and CSEC. When you look at that, does anything strike you about the way the nature of surveillance is changing?
As I mentioned, I study surveillance. I spent a lot of time on it, and those Snowden revelations were a revelation to the public, but in the community, there was, in sort of the academic community, the privacy community, this was not a surprise. We generally knew this was going on, but you didn't have the documents to be able to wave around to sort of demonstrate it. So it's kind of familiar. What does it tell us? It tells us actually one of the more important trends in surveillance is the blurring of the boundaries between the public and the private. The state, the Canadian state, the American state would never have been able to collect that amount of information. How is it that they're able to do it? Is that they're able to piggyback on the infrastructure of information collected in the private sector. So that blurring, and they're able to do this by compelling companies to do it legally, but also in the post 9/11 environment, by just enticing them, encouraging them, and saying it's a patriotic thing to do. So that blurring of the boundaries, I think, is what's really important about the NSA revelations. The sheer scope of the information is remarkable, but this has been coming almost since the first months after 9/11. One of the first initiatives in a sort of short-lived program proposed by the Bush government was something that looked like this, that they would have a centralized warehouse that would collect all of the information about everyone. And people got up in arms and they said, oh, you can't do this, but years later we're moving in that direction, but we're doing it quietly, surreptitiously. There's no public debate about it, or now we're just starting to have a public debate about it, something that's existed for some time, so the debate is occurring after the fact. So I think that's the major trend, is this blurring of the public and the private.
So do you think that the legislation that we have now and the way that we talk about privacy now is sufficient to address this changing climate?
I don't think there's anyone in the field of privacy that would sort of say the legislation we have is adequate. And I'm not a lawyer, but I sort of dabble in this area. The legislation surrounding privacy has been antiquated for years. It is not up to the task of dealing with big data, the strength of the corporations, or surely the amount of information that we have, the privacy, what I would call the privacy infrastructure. The commissioners across Canada are typically underfunded, and they also are they're reactive, and by which I mean they cannot initiate investigations. They have to depend on other people coming forward and raising issues. And they ultimately, one of the biggest issues, I think, in all of this is limited carrying capacity. That almost every day there is a new revelation about some new type of way that your information is being used and collected and manipulated. And the privacy infrastructure simply cannot do all of those battles. There is absolutely no way. So they have to make concrete strategic decisions about which ones they see are most important. But while they're fighting those battles, all of those other things just kind of grind along and they come into place. And surprise, you wake up today and this is happening in your neighborhood and there's cameras there because they cannot confront everything.
If you had the power to change the laws right now, is there something that you would say, like, okay, this is a big flaming thing that we need to really address?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things in the area of privacy and surveillance that's, I would say, a sham, is that a lot of privacy infrastructure, privacy legalities are based on the idea of consent. That people are allowed to collect your information, they're allowed to use your data as long as you consent. And that, on its face, seems like a good thing. But consent has become a sham. It has become sort of a facade, and in many ways it's become a way actually to allow corporations to collect data because nobody pays attention to any of those consent, things. I think I was surfing the other day and I saw one that was 64 pages long of legalistic jargon. That's not honest. It's not fair. And it's not meaningful. But the way in which consent has now been framed legally allows, it doesn't restrict surveillance. In fact, it actually allows it. So I think that there's something has to be done about this, what I would call this facade of consent.
Kevin, thanks so much for talking to us.
No problem.
Kevin Haggerty is a professor of sociology and criminology at the University of Alberta, where his specialty is surveillance. And he's standing right behind you.